I'm Sarah Sharp, a deal attorney who helps people buy and sell businesses every day, mainly accounting practices. And I am in the midst of my biggest deal season. So, biggest deal season ever and busiest part of the year for me normally. And on top of all of that, I had 3 deals die this week. So I'm going to tell you the 3 things that kill deals even after you've drafted the purchase agreement, kind of on the 50-yard line, right? And that was the case with all 3 of these deals that died this week. And it's very rare for me to have any deal die after a purchase agreement. So I'm reflecting on how it could be avoided and why it happened. So the first thing that kills deals of the 3, the first thing that kills deals after you've drafted the purchase agreements and you've gone through diligence is pretty simple and unfortunately pretty unavoidable. And that is something new happens, right? So whether that's somebody being sued or somebody having a data breach or a key employee quitting, that kind of thing can come up at any time. And when it happens, it doesn't matter if you've run the most clean, perfect deal ever, it's still probably the right time to walk away if you're the buyer. And if you're the seller, unfortunately, it's going to be hard to convince somebody to move forward with you, right? So it's not always that the thing is of an enormous magnitude per se. It's often simply that I'm cleaning out a drawer while I do this. It's often simply that it's happening during the same time as the deal, and the parties are just not going to have enough information quickly enough to be able to know if it's a big deal or not. Like with a data breach, you might have a data breach that's ultimately very finite and it's not like huge, nothing giant happens from it. There's just a couple affected parties, everybody's notified, the data breach is incredibly minimal and that kind of thing. But when you first learn about it, you don't know, you haven't had a chance to see if something bigger is going to come out of it. And the same with a lawsuit. It might get settled very quickly, but there's just no understanding of how big the liability will be, and it's probably not going to be something that gets resolved quickly enough for the deal to go through. So something completely unavoidable, surprising comes up. So that is a good reason for a deal to die. And usually, if a deal dies for those reasons, it's partially, at least, because they had a provision in your purchase agreement and made the person promise that those things weren't true. Because what you don't want is to not have a reason for the seller to tell you about those new bad outcomes, right? So our purchase agreements always say, I promise I'm not being sued. Article 3 reps, right? I promise I'm not being sued. I haven't been sued. I promise I don't have any employment claims. I haven't had any, if they do, they explain what they were. I promise I don't have any security breaches, that kind of thing. So if you've got those promises, then all of a sudden you're asking the seller to sign, they're going to really hesitate when all of a sudden that happens. And in all of the cases where I've had that happen, that is what sussed it out. It wasn't the seller that wanted to disclose the new thing. It was the fact that they were going to have to sign the purchase agreement that promised that thing wasn't true that made it come up. So, say what you will about a deal that doesn't make it all the way through to closing. And I know it's not a good outcome for anyone to have paid a lawyer to prepare all of the documents, but sometimes just that process is really helpful because by virtue of having those reps and warranties and having the seller look at them with their lawyer, that pushes them over the edge of disclosing something to you, the buyer, that is really important to know. And they probably should have disclosed, but they weren't totally sure they wanted to. So, while that is a failure in some ways, because the deal doesn't go through, the refrain you will hear me say in this video many times is sometimes the best deal is no deal. And if there's some huge data breach that you don't have the ability to get your arms around, or if there's some lawsuit that's going to take who knows how long to resolve, that's probably not the right deal to do then. And maybe it will be later, but it's not your opportunity. And the best deal in that instance is probably no deal. So that is the first. The second thing that can kill deals is over lawyering. You could argue under lawyering. But lawyers, there's a reason that they call us deal killers. We probably get too much blame, lawyers do, for killing deals because, I regularly tell clients that they can blame me for pulling out of a deal. Also, some deal, like you're most likely to talk to your lawyer if you're planning on pulling out of a deal. So maybe they're going to be the ones that get blamed because they were the last ones to talk to you. And they're going to help you understand your risks. So of course we're going to be there. Doctors aren't murderers, even if they're there fire when there's a lot of death, right? So we're certainly not always to blame, but sometimes we are. And in particular, this week, I had a lot of lawyers who seem to be trying their darndest to kill deals. Folks who don't have a lot of experience in the industry can certainly do it. They're, in this case, I had a lot of parallel deals where there was a lot of over lawyering, meaning 89-page purchase agreements for a $300,000 firm acquisition. It's just overdone and it's intimidating. And ultimately, in this case, the lawyers took a really hard stance on things that didn't fit the overall profile of the deal. Like not just the money, right? But so there can be $0 deals. Any deal attorney, any M&A attorney has done $0 deals on hundreds and hundreds of pages of transaction agreements where that was appropriate because the risk was so big. It can be either the purchase price is big or the risk is so enormous, the liability profile is so enormous that it justifies having that kind of legal team and legal diligence. Unfortunately, bad advice from lawyers can be, or lack of good advice. For instance, a lot of times clients will come to me and we will have a long discussion about something that they want me to do. And sometimes I will say no. And I don't think that that's right. And I'm not, I don't think I'm the right lawyer for this. So I understand if you want to do it and that's a deal point, but I'm not going to be the one to do it. Very rarely do I say that, but on occasion, I've definitely said that. Some lawyers have never, ever said that. And some lawyers that I've worked with, both on the same side, don't view their job as inclusive of business judgment calls at all. So they won't weigh in. So they might have a purchase agreement. They may have negotiated the entire profile of the terms. All of the parties have agreed on something and their client comes in and says, you know what, I want to change the purchase price and reduce it by $1 million. And whereas I and many of my colleagues would go, whoa, are you sure you want to do that? That might cause them to walk away. That is a significant and material retrade that's going to be poorly received. Let's talk about it. Some lawyers will just go, okay, and do it. And the deal blows up. Right? So it can be really valuable to have lawyers, especially ones who will kind of make sure that you're staying generally within the bumpers of what is considered market for terms. If you're trying to kill a deal because you absolutely refuse as the seller to be on the hook for anything post-closing and you're saying no indemnification, no survival requirements, I'm not going to personally sign anything. It's all going to be on behalf of the company that I'm about to dissolve after I sell these assets. That's not a very reasonable position to take. And a lot of people are not going to want to do that deal. If you have a lawyer who's not telling you that can end it. So over lawyering, certainly having someone just run to death over every tiny little feature of a deal. Someone who's wanting you to call the company that the copier lease is through to make sure that they can assign the lease at closing. Somebody who wants every single T crossed and lowercase j dotted can kill a deal just by wearing the parties out. Because in my world, which is small business, most of the sellers are also running a business and they just don't have the bandwidth to do all of those things. So if you have too big of a firm expecting too much, expecting the type of response from the other side that you would get if you had a deal team instead of just the owner doing it, that can kill it. That can absolutely kill it. The third thing in the three things that can kill a deal right before closing is just complete honest disagreement on the terms. And as much as I try to get everything agreed upon in the letter of intent, and if you've watched any of my videos, I'm sure you've seen me say that. I want the parties to put all, in a term sheet or a letter of intent, everything that they can about what they agreed to. On very rare occasion, even still doing that, the parties draft the purchase agreements, and it's only in the negotiation of those agreements do we finally realize that there's just a disagreement about a material term. So usually when that happens with me, I've put everything I can in the LOI prior to the deal getting very far. So usually we know if we don't have alignment on the terms. But so if there is a subsequent just good faith non-alignment on terms, it's usually something that's, let's say, kind of not something you would put in a term sheet or an LOI. So it's more of a subsequent type of class B terms. So some really legalese type of things, governing law, indemnification. I even put indemnification, cap, and survival stuff in my letters of intent, but sometimes people come to me and they've already executed a letter of intent, and so that hasn't been decided upon yet. So, usually when something goes all the way through being drafted and ultimately falls apart, it is something that is in the legal realm, like indemnification, survival, personal guarantee, collateral, that kind of thing. They just didn't have any reason to talk about earlier. And it's hard to avoid. Unfortunately, some people, you can say this is market, this isn't market. You can have two lawyers on a call, like I was on earlier, that said, I have done a blah, 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 millions of these deals and I've never. And the other one says, me, well, I've done blah, 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 these deals and I've never. Like, who cares? If ultimately the parties just don't agree to a term and they can't allocate the liability, if the buyer is just not willing to personally guarantee the note and they never talked about it before, if the seller is just not willing to personally represent the status of the business as good and in good shape, and they've never talked about it before until you're deep on a call with a bunch of lawyers going through the agreements, that's just one of those things that unfortunately sometimes happens. We can't touch every single point in the letter of intent, and so, unfortunately, like happened today, even if you do, the parties can change their minds. So those are the three main ways that I see deals die, unfortunately, before closing, but after you've drafted the transaction documents. We do everything we can to avoid them. Check out dealacademy.org for more ways to avoid killing a deal. But remember that sometimes deals die, and sometimes the best deal is no deal.